Hi, today's August 8th, 2023, and I'm honored to have as guest, second time, Brian Chau. Tell us what you've been up to, what you've been writing and thinking about.
Yeah, so I think that the last time we spoke, we were speaking about my writing at pluralism.ai, and yeah, I have a machine learning background, and now I'm doing essentially a combination of reporting and just explanations of existing papers. And I actually have something very interesting to announce, which is that myself and a few other people are launching a new think tank called Alliance for the Future, affuture.org. And I think it's particularly important because right now, I don't think this is because of any kind of like conspiracy, but this is just how things have played out. There's just a lot more power on the side of regulatory capture, of restricting machine learning, of making it only be usable by a few elite players instead of, essentially allowing all people who have access to the technology, who either want to develop it open source or, are willing to pay for a version of the product to use it, to essentially place these artificial restrictions. And I find it very important to have a counterbalance to that. And that's exactly, that's exactly what we're trying to create. We've looked at, the lobbying efforts, the kind of efforts at regulatory capture, the efforts trying to prevent new competitors from going in to machine learning through the government. And we think that we should do the opposite, that we should encourage more competitors, that we should encourage more exploration, and that on net machine learning will just be a huge positive. So we can go more on what we're doing there or what the major concerns that I have are.
Well, I'd like to hear how you got together and what would be Archimedes said, give me a lever long enough and I'll move the world.
Right.
So you need a big lever to move any part of the world. First of all, I'm not even sure what the world is. I mean, it's kind of an amorphous glob. A lot of people are just watching, Housewives, Housewives of New Jersey or something like that. I can't remember the shows. I mean, who knows what the world is and how people think. But you're not really interested in motivating the world. I think you're interested in motivating a certain part of the kind of the intelligentsia, the thinking part, behind the thinking parts. So, I mean, we have computers and we have AI, which is artificial intelligence, but that presumes there's real intelligence in a way. How, what would be your goal aside from, say, a plurality of thought and being able to have ideas percolate up? Can you expand a little bit on that?
Right. So the great thing about the present day, this is actually not an idea that's original to me. Mark Andreessen talked about it on my podcast, which will probably be out by the time this releases as well. And he talks about, it's a natural for people, once they use a technology, to become defenders of it. So we're talking on the internet now. There are billions of people on the internet, and they, in large part, love it. If you tried to ban the internet now, then there would just be huge opposition. You'd never get reelected. The same was not true about the internet 20 years ago. When it was emerging, there were many acts to try to stop the internet. It was mainly opposed not by the public, but by essentially an organized elite of people basically looking at the political consequences, looking at the economic consequences, and saying, we cannot have this. This would be extremely destructive. And I think the same pattern is playing out today. The same pattern is playing out today, where if we have the same free and open development of machine learning, then in 20 years, people will be using ChatGPT, or even sooner. In 10 years, you'll have the majority of the country using language models, using other applications of machine learning. And in large part, it'll be, just like the internet. It'll be, there'll be costs and there'll be benefits. But on net, the benefits will be way larger. And everyone will agree that it would be kind of extremely destructive to ban it. But we are in that moment right now. We are in the moment where people are attempting to ban machine learning, trying to heavily restrict it, trying to build a fence around it so that only their company can reap the profits. And we are trying to make sure that, it plays out like the internet. If it plays out like the internet, where there is continued open development, where people are able to build on it, people are able to collaborate on it, people are able to use it freely, then we will consider that a huge victory.
Well, I would as well. I think there's always a conflicting pathway. You know, we think of the internet. Are you in Canada?
Yes, for a little bit longer.
Okay, so we're in the United States, and Canada has maybe a little more restriction than the U.S. But there's some place you can be, and the internet is not quite the thing we think of it as. I mean, I think if you're in Iran or China, you're going to have different concepts of what the internet is, different concepts of Twitter, if it exists, or X or whatever, and there's this continued battle between the despots and freedom, and I don't know if you ever watched The Wizard of Oz. Did you grow up watching Wizard of Oz at all?
Yeah.
Okay, so I really love The Wizard of Oz, and I find it's hugely, I don't know, for some reason it resonates with me, because the man behind the curtain, the green curtain, is the wizard, and he's not necessarily totally wizardly, but things are running in Oz. I mean, you have to give him credit. Oz is a kind of an amazing place, and people are running around, and they come to him searching for answers. And I'm not going to say who he is, whether he's AI or a computer or whatever, but at the end of the day, the Toto, the innocent dog, pulls the curtain back, and the guy turns out to be a kind of a small man, whatever, at least physically, with large dreams, and they came with demands. They came, the lion wanted bravery, the scarecrow wanted brains, the Tin Man wanted courage, and Dorothy wants to go home. Now, what he actually proves to each of them is they actually had it within their own hearts, and I find this I find this deeply touching. And I apologize for being a sap, but it's an amazing thing that the wizard actually does perform a wizardly function, even though he's not a wizard. He informs each of them. He says, the lion, you were brave, you demonstrated bravery, you have bravery, and ditto. He's basically, each of them had it within them, and they already demonstrated those characteristics that they're in search for. And obviously, as people, we're in search for all the time, and we're using these different modalities to try to, transplant and supplant a lot of our ideas, to get a template for a sense who we are. So we're doing a lot of mirroring and so forth. But where is the wizard in all of this? I mean, the wizard at some point. We are on a search, and we use a lot of these modalities, internet and then artificial intelligence, to make a good paper for us, to make show our intelligence, to interact with people, to get a date. We're using a lot of modalities to get things that maybe we used to get at some other time, but maybe we're getting it more perfectly. I don't know whether my analogy resonates with you at all. Just tell me if I'm correct.
Well, here's the thing: the wizard has to be us. It has to be humans, if you just leave OpenAI, or if you leave ChatGPT just sitting there, it's not going to do anything. You have to give it the direction. It's the Tin Man looking for a heart. I do think you're right. A lot of people on the internet, people use this phrase, crisis of meaning, and it really is sort of a crisis of direction, right? A crisis of wanting some feature that they may or may not already have, some kind of telos, some kind of motivation to do something in the world. In a way, I don't know. I try not to think of things as too connected. I try to look at things within their own area of kind of technical
Right.
analysis.
You're not going to go hunting with a pool cue. You're not going to.
Yeah, I don't want to say, like some people, like Mark Andreessen will say, like AI will save the world, right? He will make, and that is a little bit cheeky. That is a kind of reference to some other religious tendencies when people think about AI. But I think that it's a very positive technology. I think it'll do great things. I'm not sure if it'll solve the crisis of meaning. I'm not sure if it's that powerful. At the end of the day, I think people will have to go out, and this was never easy, like in all of human history, like people fought wars over this, people died for this, people, really struggled. And so I don't think there are any easy answers. There's no yellow brick road. But
well, there is a yellow brick road. We're on it.
There?
We're on it. Well, depending, maybe. So I kind of like the pluralistic approach. But kind of getting back to the wizards and despots in China and Iran, I do think that there's a kind of a friction between people wanting things and kind of I think the natural state is to interact and to bounce ideas, and the concept that all of us are smarter than any one of us, with those who have power and feel threatened by that kind of knowledge that they will themselves be exposed as small people behind green curtains, running things that they're not necessarily qualified for. I think we see this in China and other places like it, wherein the leaders, I think the biggest threat is people getting smart enough to realize the wizard's not a wizard. And previously in other centuries, that the king is not divine. I think that there's a natural tendency to shut people away from that. You're probably too young for the Soviet Union, but I was behind the Iron. I spent some time traveling with the possibility of leaving behind the Iron Curtain, and their image of the West was very much restricted. They couldn't see the things that you had in the West because it would be a threat to their whole concept of reality. If you're in North Korea, you can't see that other people are doing better, a few miles away, and they have all the things that you're eating tree bark and they're eating, ice cream shaped like tree bark, because that would take away the whole essence of your struggle for, socialist nirvana, or whatever it is.
There's something very important happening here, which is, as a friend put it, there are some things that either 95% of people believe or 0 people believe. There are some things that are just so evidently lies that even the small suggestion that they might be lies will make everyone realize this. The academic version of this argument is Timur Kuran's book, Public Truths, Private Lie, or I think it's the other way around. Public Lies, Private Truths. Always get that wrong. But the main idea of that is that many people base what they say on those around them. So if you have everyone saying the same line, then a lot of people they'll just fall in line. But if only 10% of people start disagreeing with the regime, then those people suddenly become much more sympathetic. There are some subset of people that are also joining in, who recognize that and think that, if these people are standing up, then so am I, and so on and so forth, until it goes completely in the other direction. And the reason why this is important in the context of AI is that, some people think that it's something that, is only going to be used for mass surveillance, is only going to be used to support authoritarian regimes, is only going to be used to, do Chinese central planning. And we already have examples of that not being true. China, of course, has banned foreign language models. You see many authoritarian countries cracking down, trying to prevent their use in some way. And why is that? It's because that language models are actually particularly hard to kind of to absolutely put in a box, right? They're naturally technologies that include variance, that include variation in what they say. So sometimes you ask it the same question 10 times. You expect that with most technologies, you ask it the same question 10 times, all 10 of them, they're the same. But, in many open-ended questions, that's not possible. If you ask ChatGPT to write an essay comparing the advantages and disadvantages of the American system versus the Chinese system, you actually don't want it to always output the same thing. You want it to be creative. You want it to invent, different possibilities for you to examine. And this is something that's a fundamental part of how machine learning networks operate, is the presence of probability. Now, you take that into a regime like the Chinese Communist Party, and you get that 5% out of nowhere. You get that 5% of people who are criticizing, who maybe even are willing to make the comparison between Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh, a comparison that is forbidden to make in China. This is a serious thing, by the way. For those in your audience who might be aware, the Chinese government cracks down very hard on social media posts comparing their president Xi Jinping to or their Communist Party chairman or whatever, Xi Jinping, to Winnie the Pooh. And the thing with a lot of these probabilistic models is that they will sometimes just latch onto a meme, just latch on, and here I just mean like an idea. They'll latch onto an idea just randomly. It might not happen, 100% of the time. In fact, it's very easy to adjust those probabilities through techniques that I already talked about on the previous episode. So it's possible for the Chinese government to make it biased in a way that, say, 9 times out of 10, it will support the Chinese government position. But because that like variation is so hard to control, it is actually something that is much more able to flourish in Western regimes, in Western governments, where the freedom of speech is mostly tolerated, where people are allowed to disagree and to criticize, than it is in something like the Chinese government. And I think our current state of policy reflects that.
That's really great. You've written some articles that I'd like to kind of touch on. So I'm going to make a mild segue here. Would you sent me 3, but which one would you like to talk about first?
I mean, I think we've already been discussing some of the ideas from the Fukuyama article. Mm-hmm. So I wrote an article about AI and Francis Fukuyama. There is this critique of AI that I alluded to earlier. I think most famously expressed by Peter Thiel, where he says crypto is capitalist and AI is communist. And I want to be fair to him. He's probably like there's a way in which his direction of thinking is right, where some of the earlier applications of AI, something like facial recognition, or thinking like or something like automatic filtering or logistics, right, is something that is beneficial to Chinese central planners. It is beneficial in the short term to the tasks that they wish to accomplish and for having a tighter control on their population. But, and I want to be clear that these different models, this was always only a subset of AI applications. There were early LLMs, there were early stuff like ChatGPT, right? And there were early versions of image generation as well. They, of course, were not as good as the ones today, but those prototypes still existed. But I think when Peter Thiel says something like that, he's pointing to a part of machine learning that he is right about. But if you zoom out, if you look at the bigger picture, I think that calculation definitely changes in the other direction. So Francis Fukuyama had this very famous book called The End of History and the Last Man. He argued that Western systems, number one, Western capitalist democracies, number one, created material prosperity. They created the wealth that we all enjoy, being able to use the internet, having reliable food, and so on, reliable water, and also satisfied the desire to kind of engage in a political system, the desire to matter, right? He called it thymos. And the big question is, many people have been talking about, maybe it's the end of history is not so clear anymore because you have the rise of governments like China. You had, some scares involving Russia. I think it's very clear that the West has kind of triumphed over Russia at this point. But you have the question of China, which I think is much more prominent in people's minds now. And I think that especially language models, but also these kind of more variable technologies, definitely do show many of the benefits of the kind of Western freedoms that we all enjoy to some degree or another.
When he was talking about the end of history, obviously history never ends. Did he mean that metaphorically? In what sense did that apply?
Right. So
we're not going to be warring. Obviously the idea of kind of conquest is because the only real way of material gain was to get somebody else's stuff.
I think he, in his book at least, he talks about it as a kind of geopolitical clash of visions. So if you think of the big battle of the Cold War, it was communism versus capitalism, right? It was the American way of life versus the Soviet way of life. that was the fundamental question that the war was about. You look at something like you look at something like the war in Afghanistan. That's maybe less so the case. It's just, it's much more a kind of practical, pragmatic war. There was no sense in which the U.S. thought, if we lose this war, then we're going to have to question our entire way of life. No, it was more like, there are people who did 9/11. We're going to fight this war to get rid of the people who did 9/11 and make sure that never happens again. That was at least the kind of, the public narrative was never about, that this is a kind of like philosophical struggle against radical Islam or whatever. Right, that was never the stakes of the war, and that, I think, is what Fukuyama means. That those stakes, those kind of philosophical stakes, are not really being contested anymore. And so the reason why China matters is that China is a much more centrally planned system. China is an example of a country that might actually contest with those stakes. I think that this is very unlikely, but if the U.S. were to lose to China in the long run, then people would have to reevaluate. People would have to wonder, maybe the Chinese system is actually better if that actually happened. But I think that technologies like machine learning, and especially their kind of adoption and explosion in the West, will kind of prove the Chinese system wrong.
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I kind of want to talk a little bit more of your kind of more technical article about parallelization, and whether and how that applies to the kind of societies that can bring about such a thing as LLM. And I might be too far afield here. You can rein me in if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that there are a lot of smart, math knowledgeable people in China. When the American team wins the math Olympics, it's filled with Chinese Americans. So it's the spelling bee is Indians, Hindu Americans. So anyway, it seems like there's a lot of intelligence, a lot of other places, but it also seems that here to date, I think this may change because the United States is changing. I think it's getting lethargic, kind of sodden, and weighed down by political navel gazing and counterproductive wokeism, but things that stand in the way of innovation. I think we are spending too much time iterating around the political margins. But anyway, sorry for the long question, but to date, the United States has been a much better place to grow a company, to build an idea, and all the innovation on Earth practically has come from the United States and or US-like or US-light kind of places, and we're going to include Canada and whatnot. But so China has a bulwark of knowledge, but they can't let it out and they can't apply it well. And in a sense, they're somewhat trained to be regimented in their thoughts and not allowed to have their thoughts go certain places. And probably they're either trained to, or they won't, or they don't. So in the context of building AI, I'd like to maybe have you talk about some of the processes that went into the formation and the formulations, and whether those are in a sense product of political systems and aspirations that allow us to achieve goals where the mind may go.
Right. So this is a fascinating topic. I think that the three broad strokes on AI development, number one is a lack of central planning, right? So this is a common thing that economists cover, is that central planners often fail to predict the next thing, right? Machine learning is just an excellent example. China did not prioritize machine learning. It prioritized other kind of strategic industrial policy goals, and it did not get the next thing. And even the part of Chinese, there are Chinese machine learning engineers, of course, even the part of Chinese academia that was interested in machine learning did not get the next thing in terms of what elements of machine learning would be most useful. They're more focused on other tasks, and they missed out. And maybe they're going to catch up soon. They're also developing their own large language models. I don't want to preemptively declare victory. I don't think China is kind of completely out of the race, but it's certain that their kind of direction of the economy and their direction of their own academic systems has led to a disadvantage compared to the United States, even after factoring in, the amount of Chinese talent there is. So that's the first element, and I do worry that the United States, or more so Europe, I think right now is heading towards a similar direction, where they want to take a top-down approach of having a small number of highly concentrated players, DeepMind, OpenAI, and essentially being able to bully them into doing a similar kind of top-down approach as the Chinese government. That's actually the primary reason, looking at the policies that the EU is attempting to pass. That's the primary reason we at Alliance for the Future are so concerned about this. But so that's the first reason, is just a triumph, in the Fukuyaman sense, a triumph of kind of capitalist democracy over centrally planned China. The second element is something that Mark Andreessen brought my attention to. Many people complain, somewhat correctly, about there being too many hype cycles in technology, right? So for your audience, what is a hype cycle? I'm sure you guys see this in the news all the time. It's essentially a new technology is announced, there's an immense positive coverage about it. Everyone is obsessing over it. A lot of venture capital flows into new companies who are trying to work with that technology. And so Mark Andreessen said something very interesting on my podcast, and he said, that there are going to be costs, there are going to be downsides, and there's going to be upsides of hype cycles. But the upsides are much greater than the downsides. I'd much rather have. He said that he would much rather have many more hype cycles than many fewer. And I think that his argument is right. And his argument is essentially that even if some people are overestimating the ability of some technologies, that on average, having that enthusiasm about new technologies and about the ones that do work, such as the internet, such as semiconductors, such as the processor that runs on your computer, being optimistic about that more often rather than less often, even if sometimes it's hard to tell, right? Even if sometimes people make mistakes, that leads to better outcomes than being kind of generally pessimistic. And that, I think, helps to explain not just the difference between the U.S. and China, but also the difference between the U.S. and Europe.
Right, because actually my favorite intelligence model is human. I've actually married one.
Right.
I wound up getting two new processing units as a result. They're men now, but those are amongst. I mean, probably I could get a robot to play table tennis with me or real tennis. But I enjoy so far. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I still enjoy having relations with humans, and humans, such as our operating system runs, seems to have a need for hope. I watched a video by God Saad, rhyming. I don't know if you know him. He's in Montreal.
Yeah, the biologist, right?
Right, and he had a video for PragerU about his ring. He lost his ring, and he was desolate. Or disconsolate over losing it, and then anyway they made a formulation about how they might theoretically find it, even though they've been out swimming and impossible to find it. And so many different places they've been. They're on a vacation, blah blah blah. And so anyway, they worked on things. They looked at photographs when he would have had it and didn't have. Anyway, it's a short video, it's easy to watch, but the essence is that hope, even while they were planning, took away his horrible mood of having lost it. And if he wound up losing it ultimately, at least he had given his best. And so man needs, our operating system needs hope, it needs aspiration, it needs, if that's not the same thing, it needs work, and it needs, guidance and so forth. So we need to be templated in a way that is positive for our action. So if you have kind of a negative result at the end, you almost never want to do anything from the beginning. And I think this is brought about a lot of our that's a French word, anomie, namelessness, to be without a name, and kind of the ancel, or is it incel? Incel.
I think it's incel. The incel, the men with no sexual attention.
Yeah, I watched a separate video. I'm sorry to go on. With Jordan Peterson, where an interviewer, kind of combatively said, "You're like the favorite guru for the incels," and he's like, "And what is wrong with that?" Yeah, these are men whose hopes have been dashed. I'm doing my pseudo-Canadian. And it's like, they are people, basically, a Christian kind of outlook that they live and breathe. And why should we be ignoring? Why should we be making fun of them? And if they look up to me and can better their lives, what's wrong with that? And so a lot of what we have here, getting back to parallelization, is kind of a parallel between the modeling of our models and the modeling of ourselves. I don't want to make too broad a stroke there, but do you have any thoughts on that before maybe we look more in particular, and in particular at your article?
Yeah, I think that this is. This might be the kind of objection to machine learning that I have the fewest answers for, because it sort of inverts the premises of the way that a lot of people go about life. If the question is something like, if life is so good, if you are so without challenge that you feel meaningless, then there's sort of an inversion here, where everything that makes your life better is actually making it worse. I think that is a real problem that people have to deal with. I think that, in my own personal experience, I've never felt too devoid of meaning. I really enjoy both the kind of technical and the political tasks at hand. I've always kind of found something for myself to do. But I can totally relate to someone who looks at the life of luxury, especially when I was younger. Sometimes you just lay around all day and, on the weekend, and you don't really do anything, and you don't really accomplish anything in your life. And you just look at it and you think to yourself, what have I done? What was there any purpose to my time in the first place? So that's a kind of eternal question, right? That's a kind of fundamental philosophical question. And I'll be honest, I'm not going to pretend that I have answers for everyone in that department, but I am skeptical of the idea that people on average won't find it. I am skeptical of the idea that making your life better makes your life worse in the end. That seems sort of overcorrecting to me. Right. But I do think that as our lives become more luxurious, and I think that they will, they'll become more luxurious. We'll have, higher quality things, more free time, that we're going to have to think of what we're going to do with that free time. And, it'll be a problem, but I think it'll be a solvable problem.
So do you read Dilbert ever?
Yes.
So one of my favorite, we've read so many Dilberts, my kids growing up. One of my favorite Dilberts is the dinosaur, who's kind of an idiot, is leaning over Dilbert's shoulder. And this is, probably 30 years ago. And he's working on a computer, and dinosaur's like, so how come you're always on the computer? It says, well, I save a lot of time working on the computer. He says, oh, what are you going to do with all the time you save? He says, work on the computer.
Yeah, and people are playing games now. But I do actually want to be really optimistic about this. Have you ever seen this game, GeoGuessr?
Well, let me think. I might have. Tell me more about it.
Right. So the premise of it is that you just get a random location somewhere in the world, right? Usually these beautiful pictures that people have taken for Google Maps, or that the cars have taken for Google Maps.
Yeah.
And your job is to guess where in the world it is, and you get points for how close you are to the actual to the place it is in the world, to the correct answer. And there are people who are just stunningly good at this game, who can guess the right country almost all of the time, who can guess within 10 kilometers even on some pictures, which they've never seen before, which are completely brand new pictures, but they just recognize something. They recognize the sign, or they recognize the Mongolian grass. Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's just amazing. Yeah. And this is something that's pretty fun to try out on your own. I don't think this is something that I've tried for
Yeah, no,
a bit.
I like a lot of games. I do cryptic word puzzles, and every time I get one, I'm like, oh my god! Like for 20 minutes, I'm like, this one's impossible. I can never, ever do this. And then, either half hour, an hour, a couple hours later, sometimes a couple days, like it's all done. It's like I feel such accomplishment. And I show it to my wife. She's like, yeah. You say that about every single one of them. I'm like, no, but that one was really hard. but this is this weird sense of accomplishment. I didn't go anywhere. But the ability to kind of refine and define things is refine your mind as you define things around you. This is totally off topic, but somewhere, I don't know, probably 40 years ago here, we started calling people Asian Americans. I'm like, that seems so reductive. Like, I think there's so vast difference between Chinese and Koreans, between Japanese and Indians, between Saudis and Kazakhs. You're putting, those are all Asia. It's like, to say they're Asian, what does that even mean? It's a huge continent, billions of people, and somehow they are all the same to you in some way. I used to do immigration exams as part of my medical work, and so I had a kind of a quick query and response about where people are from. People that come from all over the world, and I would see them, and then I'd be able to look at their chart and know exactly where they're from. So I'm pretty good at being able to, when somebody's come from Africa, I don't say they're African. I'm like, oh, that guy looks, he looks Somali. He's Kenyan. He looks, I'm not sure if it's Malawi or Rwanda, but he's somewhere right in there. And I'm like, I've got guys in, if I hear a French accent, I can, pretty much pick Cameroon versus, anyway, it's like people are just shocked. If you have Uber drivers or whatever, that you can kind of really, not the same kind of thing, but kind of geolocate themselves. And I used to study geography as a kid, so I can pretty much say, oh, if I think somebody's Cameroonian, then my driver will say, it's like crash the car. But it's a fun thing. There's so much information out there. But I'm interested in your mind, and I kind of do want to touch base on this article you had. Maybe you can just kind of go over. Let's see, which one is it? I got to get the right one.
Diminishing returns in machine learning.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was more a counter argument to, or I shouldn't say a counter argument, because I'm not, I'm friends with many of the people who I talk to about this, but a kind of correction to what many people assume is sort of an indefinite growth in machine learning. Mm-hmm. Right. And you see this with many technologies. You saw this with crypto. People thought the price of Bitcoin was just going to keep going up. You see this with earlier with Uber, of course, a very successful company, and of course a company that I think is net good for the world. But it also stopped growing at some point, and so on and so forth. You see this with many technologies. I'm told that this is a bit too early for me, but I'm told that this is also what happened with the internet, with the original .com bubble. And you see this very often in history, in post-industrial history, where there is a new technology, there is hype surrounding the technology, there's a lot of money poured into it, and then it doesn't go away, but it does slow down. Where every new dollar invested in, for example, crypto, doesn't make as much progress as it did before. Every new dollar invested in Uber doesn't make as much progress as it does before. And so this is the natural pattern of technology. Now, the question, of course, is whether this also applies to machine learning and how much it does. Because, of course, some things have to happen for a first time, right? You can't just assume that everything, that the historical pattern is going to continue indefinitely. You have to actually look at some on the ground evidence. You have to look at, how is, for example, hardware scaling changing in the past few years? What are the specific factors that have led to improvements in, for example, the hardware produced by NVIDIA? What specifically, when training a model, has been the main kind of methods of attack in order to try to make it run more efficiently? And I try to look at some of these questions. The first part of the article deals with machine learning. The other parts are still in progress. They've been kind of caught up with the more kind of administrative and media stuff that I've been doing more recently. But the core theme of this series of articles is that when you actually dive into some of the data, it very much resonates with the historical narrative. Surprise, surprise. It's sort of like the Scooby-Doo moment. What is the pattern of technological progress in machine learning? Oh, it's the same as the technological progress, or it's similar, let's say, to the technological progress of most other technologies in history. So that's the core theme of the article, and I can address more specific points if you want.
Well, I kind of was taken by the what's behind the machine of machine learning and what's behind the intelligence of artificial intelligence, and kind of the concept of what parallelization is and how that works. I did some electrical engineering, through colleges of chemistry and physics major. And you can line batteries up one way or another. Then there's parallel computing, so forth. I'm just curious about a little bit of the mechanics and whether people can relate to that. I think you're good with analogies and anecdotes and so forth. Maybe you can kind of help people put their minds around it. They may not have to, but I'm curious about it anyway.
Right. It's great to understand this one idea, because I think a lot of it not just explains machine learning, but explains much of computer science. So yeah, it's good to finally answer your question on this. So parallelization. The main idea of parallelization is that some things can be done at the same time. It's sort of like multitasking, but in a much more efficient way. So let's say that you are looking at a normal CPU. A normal CPU is kind of like it's a little bit more complicated than this, but it's kind of like a cashier at a grocery. It deals with one person. It takes their items and it processes them, and then it moves on to the next. And all of the instructions kind of queue up together. So you can think of parallelization as sort of opening up more grocery lanes. If there are things that don't rely on each other, right? So if there are multiple tasks that can be done at the same time without depending on each other, that all of these can be done, side by side. There's no reason for you to wait until the first task is done in order to do the second one. And what's very interesting in the history of machine learning, actually, is that so many companies still use GPUs for machine learning. Some like Google have more specialized TPUs, but in general, the NVIDIA GPUs are still the kind of main source of compute. And if you looked into what GPUs stand for, it stands for graphical processing units. Now, you might think in your head, is that some kind of analogy? Is that some sort of, unique naming scheme? No, it's because the history of GPUs is that they are designed to render, or that they were originally designed to render complex graphics for your video games. So people have these very, very detailed kind of geometric shapes. It takes a lot of compute in order to play essentially what is like extremely high definition video. And to do all of these geometric calculations in order to put your video correctly, right, or to play your video game correctly, this requires just an enormous amount of processing. But just like with machine learning, when you're processing those graphics, what's happening on one corner of your screen does not necessarily matter for what's happening on the other corner of your screen. So those can be processed once again in parallel. And that's what GPUs were initially designed to do, was to render these different parts of the screen at the same time much more efficiently. And now they're finding application and have more machine learning specific uses and versions where they're being used for a very similar type of parallel processing.
Yeah. So I've got a question. I hope this is not too silly a question.
Go ahead.
But this one of my young friends, a PhD candidate at MIT in quantum computing, and I always thought that this was going to be a little bit of a dead end. I know enough quantum physics to know a little bit, But I just thought that kind of basing your CPUs on uncertainty is not going to be an adequate way of having that parlay into actual knowledge. Whereas I think that a lot of what's happening with AI is, in a sense, the quantum computing aspect of computing, but using regular old binary chips, but aggregating them a little bit more, say, like the human brain, which is in a sense made of a bunch of neurons, but does act kind of polymorphously in different shapes and manners without a full individual solid answer. I don't know if that question made any sense at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's my alma mater, actually, the University of Waterloo, has a very good quantum computing institute. I don't know. From my knowledge, I'm not a subject matter expert in quantum computing, but from my knowledge, the kind of optimizations that occur when you have these kind of probabilistic qubits is very different than the optimizations done in machine learning. I mean, like the idea of parallelization has existed for a long time before, before the current machine learning models as well. It's very common in for example, networked systems, right? So in many cases, you'll have multiple servers in one server farm, and then you'll have it won't necessarily be that you have to go through all of the servers in sequence, but you can allocate some part of the server to one client. You can or you can allocate another part to a different client. All these like the idea of parallel processing is not a new idea, but it is true that machine learning is an illustration of how it can be used in a kind of very clear and straightforward way. But I would say it's not an idea that is not without prior uses. It's used almost everywhere you see computing, and I would say it's used very often in real life too, right? In real life, you also often have you often have resources that you can use to do things simultaneously. Even, for example, on like a factory, right? A factory is actually often an excellent example of parallelization, right? Where you have let's say you're making the wheels of a car and the frame of a car, and I'm not a mechanic, I don't know these things, but let's say you're making the different parts of a car separately, and you can make them in parallel and then bring them to one central point to actually be assembled. Like that's a very easy to understand version of it happening in real life as well, right? So I think that you see this property all around you.
I love that. All right, so we're kind of rounding out the hour. I'm going to let you pick a topic and/or make a summary statement. What do you think people most should learn from you, your expertise, and your efforts?
What people should learn from me
or
specifically?
Could, maybe. I don't know about should.
I don't know about me specifically, but I think the biggest thing we want to emphasize is that machine learning is downstream of human desire, right? Of human direction. If someone, that's our core philosophy at Alliance for the Future. The main idea is that the line between good and evil runs between every human, right? Every human heart. I think that's like Solzhenitsyn. And when you're dealing with new technologies, whether it's the printing press, whether it's the internet, you're always going to have both good and evil. You're going to have people who want to scam people on the internet, who want to post child pornography, and you're always going to have evil uses of new technologies. And the same was true with the printing press, of course. People fought wars over it, and yet we've had immense benefits to our real world, to our daily lives as a downstream consequence. And I think at the end of the day, human agency matters. People making decisions about what to do with themselves, what to do with the technology in front of them, that's what's going to matter in the end. And you can log on to ChatGPT and try this for yourself. See what'll happen if you don't add any agency to it, if you just leave it there. No, you can. It's a tool for you to use. It's a tool for your fellow humans to use. And I think, philosophically, I think you should trust your fellow man, and you should be optimistic about what they'll accomplish.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to end with two minor self-promotions here, if you don't mind, if I can indulge you. One is my little foray into the chat world yielded ChatCCP, the know-it-all with flair. It was Chatbot's hidden agenda. This came from frustration trying to ask it certain questions medically. And so here he's kind of posing as a doctor, maybe, I don't know. All these drawings I had AI make for me. And here, oranges come out green. They're given a superficial ethylene gas bath, and they turn orange. So you think they're oranges, but they're actually greens. If you want to think of it that way, if it's just named for the color. There's a certain applique layer to the chat GPT, the way they're organized. I don't think it's the AI aspect of the large language model per se. I think there are certain covers, like these veneers, like for the orange, that are put on top of the chat bots, such as they are now. And I was asking it questions about, well, what's considered misinformation. And I was pushing back against these things because I think these things are all actually information. And it would not give me a straight answer. And a lot of times you ask something that's politically charged, like what is a woman or something like that, you're going to get the answer du jour rather than a biologic answer. And a lot of it seems to have been, has developed. This is Tony Fauci's from Brooklyn, so I had him in the Brooklyn Bridge. Would you buy a bridge from this man? And a lot of stuff, kind of top to bottom, is potentially damaged goods because the humans, the Xi Jinpings of the ChatGPT module or others like it, Bing and so forth, will not allow you to penetrate beyond what it wants you to penetrate. And so, if, as Ted Chiang said, ChatGPT is a blurry, JPEG of the web. My feeling was that over time it would be turning more into itself because it would have more of its own input going into that blurry JPEG of the web. So it'd have an iterative effect, kind of like the dark mirrors I guess I posted here. So you wind up mostly seeing what ChatGPT had, including and emphasizing the political layers that had been applied. So I don't know if that made any sense. So that's my foray into
this. Yes, for sure. And I think the biggest lesson is that like Western pluralism works. That a friend of mine, David Rosado, has already done experiments with this. He's posted a version of ChatGPT that is more conservative as opposed to the original, which was more liberal. And I do mean like the original quite a few months ago. They've since actually, to OpenAI's credit, they've since made it more politically neutral or just make it refuse to answer. I think originally, and this was part of my reporting, what we talked about last time, it had a filter that made it give left-wing answers. And now on political topics, it kind of just refuses to answer or tries to give like a neutral answer.
I've seen that. I've noticed that.
And this is to their credit, right? This is actually, to me, much more preferable.
Yeah.
It's better that they're just saying.
I think the impetus is competition, because I'm sure. I mean, I made it as a query when I wrote the article. I said I no doubt Elon Musk is going to want to use the Twitter base of knowledge, or whatever we call that stuff we put on Twitter, to make his own X bot. Right. And lo and behold, he announced the very same thing like days after I wrote this. I'm not saying I direct Elon Musk's brain from afar. I'm not saying
all correlation is causation. Randall caused Elon to start X.AI.
Well, I think you guys, you're finding out you're just living in my matrix. I mean, that's a sad thing for humanity, but there you have it. Anyway, if people would like to support my efforts, I am working on overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. You can help support my podcast by buying the book. Even better if you read it, but at least buy it. It comes free with a picture of me right there. And it's about a pandemic you might not remember anymore, but it was a big deal in 2015-16 in Brazil, and still has not been rescinded as a concept by the WHO, CDC, or anybody else, even though it has not appeared anywhere on Earth beyond that first year, 2015, and probably not even then because they didn't have any Zika tests. They had no backwards registry of microcephaly cases in Brazil, nothing from which to compare the number that they thought they had more of. In order to have more than something, you have to know what the than part was, and they didn't know. And in retrospect, when they've started doing data reconstruction, they probably didn't have any increased microcephaly. Insofar as they did have a kind of a pandemic, it was probably one based on fear and pandemonium. Rather than is pandemonium and pandemic the same word? I don't know, but they did coincide. So there you have it. Thank you so much, Brian, for being with me today. I'm in your debt. If there's anything I can do for you, let me know. And we're going to say goodbye to everybody else.
Yeah, it was great. And there will be an upcoming series that relates to what we're talking about, relates to telos, relates to people finding purpose in the machine learning age. So you can find that at pluralism.ai when it comes out in the future. That'll probably be quite a bit in the future. I'm working with quite a few people on it. I might also send it to you to review. So that might be quite
That'd
interesting.
Be awesome. So
and you can always support the kind of nominal reason of being on the show today. You can support Alliance for the Future if you want to donate, if you want to help us keep AI as a kind of pluralistic, open, democratic technology. Then you can find us at affuture.org, future.org. And you will be able to donate. You will be able to read what we're about.
Right. So send me links to that, and I'll put it in the bio part or the heading, so forth. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and